An elegant woman walks into a high-end salon. But the moment she steps inside, everything changes. Fake smiles, cold stares, a quiet attempt to push her out. But what they don't know? She's Lucille O'Neal, the mother of NBA legend Big Shaq. And when they try to dismiss her, she makes one phone call. Minutes later, a black SUV pulls up, and out steps Shaquille O'Neal. Now, the salon isn't just facing a customer, they're facing a reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The Florida sun stretched across the city like liquid gold, painting the sky with streaks of soft orange and pink. Orlando was awake, buzzing with the hum of early morning commuters, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from corner cafes, and the distant sound of car engines blending into the rhythm of the city. This wasn't the tourist side of town. No roller coasters, no souvenir shops. This was where the real heart of Orlando beat, where people lived, worked, and built their dreams. Amidst the waking city, a sleek black SUV rolled smoothly down the boulevard, its tinted windows shielding the man inside. The vehicle was unassuming, nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just like the man himself, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq. Despite his towering 7 feet 1 inch frame and legendary basketball career, Shaq had never let fame steal his humility. He had mansions, cars, business empires, and more money than most could dream of, yet he still carried himself like a regular guy. He never forgot where he came from, never forgot the lessons his mother, Lucille O'Neal, had drilled into him from childhood. Respect, kindness, and never letting pride make you forget your people. Inside the SUV, Shaq sat comfortably in the back seat, scrolling through his phone. His schedule was packed, a commercial shoot, a charity event, and then meetings about expanding his latest business venture. Even with his schedule, his mind was elsewhere. Today was a good day. Because today, his mother was in town. Lucille O'Neal was more than just Shaq's mother. She was a presence, graceful, strong, and full of warmth, but with a quiet steel beneath her kindness. She had raised him with love and discipline, guiding him through the struggles of their early life, ensuring that no matter how big he became, he would always stay grounded. And today, she had one simple plan: a trip to the hair salon. Lucille stepped out of her town car, adjusting the elegant silk scarf draped over her shoulders. Even in her 60s, she had a regal presence. Tall, poised, and effortlessly commanding attention. She wasn't the type to show off, but there was something about her that made people take notice. She had an appointment at Madeleine's Luxe Salon, a well-known spot in one of the more affluent parts of the city. It was a place that catered to the wealthy and well-connected, where stylists treated hair like art, and the cost of a trim could feed a family for a week. She walked inside, greeted by the crisp scent of expensive shampoos and the distant hum of hair dryers. The walls gleamed with modern decor, and neatly dressed stylists floated between clients, offering practiced smiles and soft reassurances. But the moment Lucille entered, there was a shift. It was subtle. The way eyes flickered toward her. The way conversations lowered just slightly. The way the receptionist's practiced smile faltered before returning, forced and thin. Lucille felt it instantly. A hesitation. A silent judgment. She had felt it before, in different places, at different times. It wasn't new, but it still stung. The receptionist, a young woman with expertly curled blonde hair, glanced at the appointment book. Ma'am, are you sure you have an appointment here?" Lucille's gaze remained steady. "Yes, booked under Lucille O'Neal." The receptionist's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Oh, right. Let me check." She took a little too long, as if searching for an excuse. Lucille waited, her expression unreadable. Finally, the woman nodded. "Yes, I see it now. Please have a seat." Lucille walked toward the plush waiting area, aware of the murmurs behind her. A few clients glanced at her, some curious, others indifferent. Then she overheard something. Not loud, not obvious, but enough. "She must be lost," one stylist muttered under her breath. Another chuckled, "Or looking for somewhere more fitting." Lucille sat down, her back straight, her dignity unshaken. But deep inside, something burned. She had been in rooms filled with billionaires, had stood beside presidents, had raised a son who was one of the most recognized figures in the world. Yet here, she was just another black woman being judged. Outside, Shaq's SUV rolled to a stop in front of a production studio. He adjusted his jacket, preparing for the commercial shoot, but as he reached for his phone, something nagged at him. A feeling. His mother had been excited for this salon visit. It was rare for her to treat herself. And yet, she hadn't texted him like she usually did. Something felt off. Shaq dialed her number, leaning back as the line rang. "Hey, Ma," he said when she picked up. There was a pause, then a soft sigh. "Hey, baby." Her voice was steady, but Shaq knew better. He frowned. "You good?" Another pause. Then she exhaled. "I'm fine. Just, you know how some places are." Shaq sat up straight. "Where are you?" Lucille chuckled lightly. "At my appointment, don't worry about it." Shaq's jaw tightened. His mother was strong, but he knew that tone. The kind she used when she was hurt, but didn't want to make a fuss. His grip on the phone tightened. "I'll be there in 10. Lucille laughed. "Shaquille, don't you dare." Click. Shaq had already ended the call. Back in the salon, the stylists whispered as they worked, throwing occasional glances toward Lucille. They weren't outright rude, but the energy was clear. "You don't belong here." Lucille remained poised, pretending not to notice. Then, the door chimed, and the room changed. All at once, heads turned. Conversations stopped. Because standing in the doorway, towering, unreadable, and unmistakable, was Shaquille O'Neal. The air in the salon shifted. The receptionist, the stylists, the clients, all of them now fully aware of who they had just dismissed, who they had just subtly insulted. Shaq didn't move at first. He just stood there, his dark eyes scanning the room. His mother met his gaze. And that was all it took. Shaq's presence was a storm waiting to break. And in that moment, the entire salon realized. They had made a mistake. Lucille O'Neal stepped through the glass doors of Madeline's Luxe Salon, and for a brief moment there was silence. The kind of silence that wasn't loud or obvious, but heavy in the air, like the last note of a song hanging before it fades. The scent of designer shampoos and expensive styling products filled the space, and the soft hum of blow dryers and casual conversation floated around the room. At first glance, everything seemed normal. A couple of stylists were working on clients, chatting about weekend plans and vacations. The receptionist, a young woman with icy blonde hair, sat behind the desk, tapping at her keyboard. Another stylist flipped through a glossy fashion magazine near the front, her manicured nails clicking against the pages. But as soon as Lucille took a few steps inside, something shifted. The conversations lowered, the glances flickered. The receptionist, who had just been smiling at another woman moments before, now looked up with a different expression, one that wasn't exactly rude but wasn't welcoming either. Lucille felt it. She always felt it. She was used to walking into rooms where people made assumptions before she ever said a word. She knew what it was like to be measured, evaluated, and judged based on things that had nothing to do with who she was. Still, she held her head high. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I have an appointment. Lucille O'Neal." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Let me check." Lucille stood still, watching. The young woman's eyes darted across the screen, but something in her body language suggested she wasn't really looking for the name. She was looking for a reason to say the appointment wasn't there, a reason to redirect Lucille elsewhere. Finally, after what felt like too long, the receptionist forced a smile. "Oh, I see it now. You're with Stephanie." A short, uncomfortable pause. But Stephanie had something come up. She won't be in today. Lucille raised an eyebrow. She had been through enough in life to know when she was being lied to. "That's strange," she said smoothly. "I just confirmed my appointment this morning." The receptionist shifted in her chair. "Right, well, sometimes schedules change last minute." Lucille let the silence hang for a second longer than necessary, watching the woman squirm under her gaze. "Well," In that case, she said, adjusting the strap of her purse, I'll take someone else. The receptionist blinked. Oh, Behind the desk, a younger stylist, a woman in her late 20s with sleek brown hair tied into a ponytail, glanced up, hesitant. She had been flipping through appointment notes but suddenly became very interested in her screen. Lucille noticed. The receptionist cleared her throat. It's just that we're actually really booked today. Lucille tilted her head slightly. Is that so? A pause. Then, right on cue, the salon doors swung open, and a new client walked in. A woman, likely in her 50s, dressed in a crisp white blazer and diamond-studded earrings. She barely made it 2 steps inside before a stylist rushed forward with an eager smile. Mrs. Collins, the stylist greeted warmly. We're so happy to see you. Let me get you seated right away. Lucille watched as Mrs. Collins was led to a chair, no appointment needed, no hesitation, no excuses. The receptionist's fake smile faltered slightly as she realized Lucille had seen the entire thing. Lucille turned back to her, her expression calm. Seems like you do have room after all. The receptionist swallowed hard. At that moment, a more senior stylist appeared. She was older than the others, probably in her mid-40s, with jet black hair cut into a sharp bob and an air of authority around her. The kind of woman who didn't bother hiding her opinions. She took one look at Lucille and sighed, just barely. Then she turned to the receptionist. What's the issue? The receptionist lowered her voice. She's, a walk-in. Lucille smirked. She wasn't about to let them play that game. I have an appointment, she corrected, with Stephanie, who I was just told is unavailable. The senior stylist, her name tag read Renee, folded her arms and looked Lucille up and down. Lucille knew what that look meant. She had seen it before. Listen, ma'am, Renee said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. There are plenty of other salons that might be a better fit for you. Lucille's fingers curled slightly at her sides. A better fit? Renee offered a thin-lipped smile. You know, a place that caters to your specific hair needs. Lucille let the words sink in. She could feel the attention of the entire room now. Some people are watching closely. Others pretend not to notice. This wasn't just about a missed appointment anymore. This was about something deeper. Lucille took a slow breath in. She had dealt with women like this before. People who spoke in carefully chosen words, disguising their exclusion as helpful advice. And yet, she refused to back down. I'll wait, she said, her voice unwavering. Since you're booked solid, I'll take the next available stylist. Renee's expression tightened. She hadn't expected pushback, but before she could say anything else, another stylist, a younger girl with auburn curls, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She looked up at Lucille, hesitated for a brief moment, then spoke. I just finished my last client, she said cautiously. I could take her. Renee shot her a sharp look. The girl instantly regretted speaking. A thick tension filled the room. The unspoken rules of the salon were suddenly broken. Lucille saw the panic in the girl's eyes. She was young, probably new here, probably afraid of losing her job. And Lucille wasn't about to let her take the fall. No, thank you, sweetheart, she said gently. I don't need a stylist who's being forced to serve me. She turned her gaze back to Renee. The real problem. Tell me something, Miss Renee, Lucille said, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as a knife. Do you treat all your paying customers this way? Or just the ones you assume can't afford to be here? A flicker of something crossed Renee's face. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. The receptionist shifted awkwardly behind the desk. The other stylists, the ones who had laughed or whispered moments before, suddenly avoided eye contact. Lucille let the silence stretch. Then, with the grace and dignity she had earned over a lifetime, she reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, and, with no rush, no urgency, she dialed a number. She held it to her ear, waiting. A beat. Then, "Hey, baby." Shaq's voice, deep and warm, filled the air, and in that moment, everything changed. Renee's posture stiffened. The receptionist's mouth parted slightly. Everyone in that room suddenly realized who Lucille O'Neill was. Lucille smiled, slow and knowing. She locked eyes with Renee, her voice smooth as honey. "Shaquille," she said into the phone, "I need you to come down here for a second." And just like that, the entire salon went dead silent. The air inside Madeline's Luxe salon felt thick, like the moment before a storm when the wind dies down, and everything holds its breath. The tension coiled around the room, invisible but heavy, pressing against the walls, the furniture, the people. The unspoken rules of places like this were being tested. Lucille O'Neill still sat in the plush waiting chair, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other woman waiting for an appointment. But the ones inside the salon knew better. They had witnessed what just happened. The cold dismissal, the passive-aggressive tone, the carefully chosen words that told her she did not belong. And yet, she remained. Across the room, other clients pretended to be absorbed in their own worlds. Some scrolled through their phones, others flipped through magazines, and a few stared into the salon mirrors, avoiding eye contact. But their ears were open. They had heard everything. Near the front, a woman with shoulder-length platinum blonde hair sat in one of the stylist chairs, her eyes darting between Lucille and the staff. She had been coming to this salon for years, and she had seen this before, not just with Lucille, but with other women who didn't fit the usual clientele. She had watched the same forced smiles, the same coldness, the same tactics used to push them out without outright saying, "Leave." She shifted in her seat, uneasy. She wasn't the type to speak up. She had never been. But something about this felt wrong. Not far from her, a younger woman, maybe in her late 20s, sat quietly in the corner, getting her nails done. She, too, had noticed. The moment Lucille walked in, she had sensed the shift in energy. It had taken less than a minute for the stylists to make their judgment, to decide that she didn't fit here. She kept her gaze down, pretending to focus on the manicurist filing her nails, but inside, her stomach twisted. She wanted to say something. She wanted to ask the receptionist, "Why did you lie? Why did you act like she didn't have an appointment?" But she didn't, because she knew that in places like this, silence was the price of comfort. She let out a quiet breath and did what everyone else did. She said nothing. At the front desk, the receptionist tapped at her keyboard, her fingers moving faster than necessary. She didn't need to type anything. She was just trying to look busy, trying to act like she wasn't aware of the tension sitting like a stone in the middle of the room. Renee, the senior stylist, had retreated to the back of the salon, whispering to another stylist near the sinks. Their voices were low but sharp. "This is a high-end establishment," Renee muttered, her irritation barely concealed. "I don't know why she's making such a scene." The other stylist, a woman with caramel-colored waves pinned up in a clip, nodded. "It's always the ones who want to prove a point." Renee sighed, shaking her head. She should know there are places for people like her. People like her. The phrase hung in the air, weighty, full of meaning. The receptionist glanced toward Lucille again, then leaned in. "Did you hear who she called?" she whispered. "Her son." Renee frowned. "And?" The receptionist hesitated, lowering her voice even more. "I think it's him." For the first time since the conversation started, Renee's confidence faltered. The other stylist raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The receptionist swallowed. "I mean, I think her son is Shaquille O'Neill." Renee's jaw tightened. That name carried weight. She cast another look toward Lucille, who still sat there, silent, waiting. Renee didn't like it. She had handled customers like this before, women who walked in expecting to be treated like they were special, but this was different. This woman wasn't arguing. She wasn't yelling or making a fuss. She was just waiting. And somehow, that was worse. The blonde woman in the styling chair took a slow sip of her coffee, her fingers lightly tapping against the ceramic cup. The quiet tension in the room was suffocating now. She turned slightly toward the younger woman getting her nails done. Their eyes met for a flicker of a second. Neither of them spoke, but they knew. The blonde woman set her cup down on the counter and let out a small breath. Then finally, She turned toward Lucille. "You know," she said, her voice light but intentional, "I've been coming here for a long time, but I've never seen them turn someone away like that before." The words cut through the silence. Lucille turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. The receptionist's face paled. Renee froze mid-step. The younger woman with the manicure held her breath. No one had expected anyone to say something. Lucille studied the blonde woman, her gaze careful. She had met women like this before, the kind who saw what was happening, but only spoke up when the discomfort was too obvious to ignore. Still, Lucille nodded. "It's interesting, isn't it?" she said, her voice smooth as honey. "The way some places change the rules depending on who walks in." The blonde woman flushed slightly, but held her ground. "Yes, it is." Another silence. This one felt different, because now the spell was breaking. Now more people were looking. Renee straightened her shoulders, her face hardening. "We aren't changing any rules," she said, forcing a small laugh. "There must have been some confusion with the appointment, that's all." Lucille turned fully toward her now, folding her hands in her lap. "Then why did I see someone else walk in without an appointment and get a chair within seconds?" Renee opened her mouth, then closed it. The room was shifting. The receptionist suddenly looked very busy with her computer screen. The younger stylist, the one who had offered to take Lucille earlier, shifted uncomfortably, because they all knew the truth. They had let this happen. And now, the woman they had dismissed so easily wasn't just another customer. She was someone important. And worse, she wasn't alone anymore. The blonde woman had spoken. The younger woman, with the manicure, was listening. Other clients were starting to watch. The balance of power in the room was tilting, and Renee knew it. Her jaw clenched slightly, and she took a small step back as if recalculating. Lucille didn't move. She just sat there, waiting. And in that waiting, everything changed. Lucille O'Neill pushed open the heavy glass door of Madeline's Luxe Salon, stepping into the bright Florida sunlight. The heat pressed against her skin, warm but familiar, grounding her in a moment she didn't quite want to process yet. She took a slow breath, smoothing the front of her blouse with steady hands. From the outside, she looked composed, elegant, poised, untouched. But inside, there was a familiar weight pressing against her chest. Not anger, not surprising, just exhaustion. She had lived long enough to know how the world worked. She had raised 4 children as a single mother, worked multiple jobs, sacrificed sleep, comfort, and time just to make sure they had what they needed. She had fought battles far harder than this. And yet, somehow, moments like this still stung. Lucille stood on the sidewalk, her fingers hovering over her phone. She didn't like bothering Shaq with things like this. He was a busy man, always moving, always juggling 1,000 things at once. She had raised him to focus on the positive, to keep his head up no matter what. But today, she needed to hear his voice. She dialed his number, lifting the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice. Then, "Hey, Ma." The deep, familiar warmth of Shaquille O'Neal's voice cut through the tension in her chest like a knife through butter. Lucille closed her eyes for a brief second, exhaling slowly. "Hey, baby," she said softly. Shaq immediately knew something was off. His mother's voice was always strong, always filled with light, even on her worst days. But now, there was a heaviness behind it, a weight she was trying to hide. He sat up straighter in his chair, his massive frame casting a shadow over the bright white set of the commercial he was filming. The production crew bustled around him, cameras being adjusted, lights shifting, assistants scrambling to get everything perfect. A director with a clipboard was mid-sentence, talking about the next scene, but Shaq wasn't listening anymore. His focus was elsewhere. "What happened?" His voice was calm but firm. Lucille hesitated, a mother's instinct. She didn't want to worry him, didn't want to add stress to his already packed day. "Oh, nothing, sweetheart," she said with a small chuckle. "Just one of those days." Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. One of those days. A phrase he knew too well. He had heard it before, Whenever she was overworked but wouldn't complain. Whenever money was tight but she'd insist they were fine. Whenever someone had treated her unfairly, but she didn't want to burden him with it. Lucille O'Neill was a strong woman. She never played the victim, which meant that if she was calling him now, like this, with that tone, it was bad. "Talk to me," Shaq said, his voice lower now, controlled, serious. Lucille sighed, shifting slightly on the sidewalk. "I went to that salon. The one I booked an appointment at," she said, keeping her voice light. "They didn't want me there, Shaquille. They tried to turn me away." Silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of 1,000 emotions, all colliding at once. Shaq stared straight ahead, his jaw clenching. He felt something in his chest, something cold and tight. He had been through a lot in his life. He had dealt with criticism, racism, doubters and haters since the day he picked up a basketball. People had judged him for his size, his voice, his background, his success. He had learned to shrug it off. But this was his mother. The woman who had given him everything, who had raised him on her own, sacrificing things he never even knew about just so he could have a chance at something better. And someone had disrespected her. He could feel his pulse in his ears. "Where are you now?" he asked. His voice was too calm, too controlled. Lucille hesitated again. "Shaquille." "Where, Ma?" She sighed, knowing there was no stopping him now. "I'm still outside the salon," she admitted. "I just needed some air." Shaq stood up. The production crew instantly noticed. The director frowned, glancing at the assistant. Where's he going? We're still rolling in 5 minutes." Shaq ignored them. He motioned for his assistant, who was already scrambling to grab his things. "I'm on my way," he told his mother. Lucille let out a small, knowing laugh. "Shaquille, now don't go making a scene. Just sit tight," he said, already walking toward the exit. He ended the call before she could argue. The second he stepped outside, the Florida heat hit him, but he barely noticed. His driver was already by the SUV, holding the door open, reading the tension in his boss's face. "Where to, Mr. O'Neill?" Shaq climbed in, his movements sharp. "The salon," he said. "Now." Back outside Madeline's Luxe salon, Lucille stood still, holding her phone in her hand. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. She had tried to stop him from coming, but she knew better. Her son had a heart bigger than his entire body. He loved fiercely, protected even fiercer. And when it came to her, there was no stopping him. A part of her felt guilty. She had handled things like this before. She had walked away from 1,000 moments of subtle discrimination, choosing dignity over confrontation. She didn't need saving. But another part of her, the part that was still hurting, felt something else. Not relief, not satisfied, but justice. For once, she wouldn't have to swallow the moment whole. For once, they would have to face what they had done. A gust of wind blew through the street, ruffling the silk scarf around her shoulders. And as she looked up, she saw it. The sleek black SUV pulling up to the curb. The back door opened, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neill. The entire sidewalk seemed to shift. People walking past did double takes, heads whipping around. A couple in a parked car literally froze mid-conversation. A group of teenagers on their bikes skidded to a halt. Because when Shaq stepped into a space, it changed. Not just because he was 7 feet 1 inch and built like a wall, but because his presence was undeniable. Lucille watched as her son straightened, scanning the building, his expression unreadable. He looked calm, too calm, and that was how she knew. He was furious. Without a word, he stepped toward her, his steps controlled. "Hey, Ma," he said softly. Lucille looked up at him, her lips pressing together. "Hey, baby." Shaq didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't need to. He could see it, the way she held herself, the way she was forcing herself to be unshaken. He exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly toward the salon. "They in there?" Lucille sighed. "Shaquille?" "They in there?" he repeated, his voice lower now. Lucille looked at her son, really looked at him, and knew she wouldn't stop him. So instead, she reached forward, gently straightened the collar of his shirt and said, "Go handle it." Shaq gave a slow nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked inside. Inside Madeline's luxe salon, the air was thick with an unspoken tension. The stylists went back to work, their hands moving through hair with forced ease, but the room felt off, like a stage where everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. Lucille O'Neill was still outside, standing on the sidewalk in the golden Florida sunlight. The glass doors of the salon gave a clear view of her, poised and still, waiting. And then, everything changed. A woman near the front, a client getting highlights, casually picked up her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly. Her manicured fingers stopped mid-swipe, her brows furrowed. She leaned in, squinting at her screen, and then she gasped. Not loud, but sharp enough that the stylist working on her hair glanced up. The woman turned to her friend, who was seated in the chair beside her, flipping through a magazine. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Do you know who that is?" she murmured. The friend barely looked up. "Who?" The woman gestured toward the window, toward Lucille. "Her last name is O'Neill," she said, excitement creeping into her voice. "As in, Shaquille O'Neal." The magazine lowered. The friend blinked. "Wait, what?" "I just checked. That's his mother." The whisper spread like a match to dry paper. One by one, heads turned. One by one, the realization dawned. The receptionist, who had been trying to look busy behind the desk, froze. The stylist at the back, who had been quietly making remarks earlier, went stiff. Even Renee, the senior stylist who had dismissed Lucille so casually, felt a slow, sinking dread settle in her stomach. Because now, they knew. They hadn't just brushed off any woman. They had brushed off the mother of one of the most recognizable men in the world. And worse, she had called him. The younger stylist, the one who had nervously offered to take Lucille earlier, stood near the sinks, gripping the edge of the counter. She had a bad feeling about this. "I think he's coming," she whispered to one of the other stylists. The other woman, a brunette with tight curls, swallowed hard. "You think he's actually gonna show up?" she whispered back. A silence stretched between them. Then, the answer walked through the door. The moment Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside, the entire salon seemed to contract. It wasn't just his size. Though at 7 feet 1 inch, he took up more space than anyone in the room. It wasn't just his presence, though that alone was enough to make people pause. It was the way he carried himself. His steps were slow, measured. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, but his silence was thick with intention. Every single person in that salon felt it. The blonde woman at the front desk, visibly tensed. The stylist nearest to the door, a man with slicked back hair, quickly looked away. Shaq's eyes didn't move. They were locked onto Renee. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the comb in her hand. She wasn't used to feeling small. But right now, with Shaquille O'Neal staring her down, she felt like a child who had just been caught in a lie. Lucille stepped inside behind him, calm as ever. But there was a quiet triumph in her eyes. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had just waited. And now? Now they were all reckoning with what they had done. The blonde receptionist forced a smile. "Mr. O'Neill, what a surprise," she said, her voice just a little too bright. "How can we help you today?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his mother, his voice smooth but low with unspoken weight. "You good, Ma?" Lucille smiled softly. "I am now." Shaq nodded once. Then finally, he turned toward the staff. His deep voice filled the space, calm but razor sharp. "I just came to see the place that didn't have room for my mother," he said. Dead silence. Renee's grip on her comb tightened. "Mr. O'Neill, Shaq raised a hand, just a small motion, not threatening. Just enough to make her stop talking. "That's funny to me," he continued, "'cause from what I see, y'all got plenty of space." His eyes swept over the empty chairs. Renee swallowed. "I think there was some miscommunication." Shaq didn't blink. "Miscommunication?" he repeated. His voice was too calm. The receptionist jumped in. We We would love to fix this. Maybe offer Mrs. O'Neill a complimentary service today. Shaq chuckled. It wasn't a friendly laugh. No need, he said. Lucille smiled. I think I'll find a place that actually wants my business. Renee paled. Shaq took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough so that only Renee could hear. Next time, he said, his voice carrying a quiet finality, be careful who you dismiss. Renee's breath hitched. Then, without another word, Shaq turned back to his mother. You ready, Ma? Lucille nodded, stepping toward the door with quiet dignity. As they walked out, the room remained frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. And as the doors swung shut behind them, the realization fully settled in. They hadn't just lost a customer today. They had made a mistake that would never be forgotten. The black SUV pulled up to the curb in front of Madeline's Luxe Salon, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun. The street, which had been busy with pedestrians and shoppers, seemed to slow down as the back door opened. And then, he stepped out. Shaquille O'Neal. Towering. Silent. Completely unreadable. For a moment, he just stood there, his massive frame casting a shadow over the sidewalk. His presence alone was enough to change the atmosphere. People on the street turned their heads, whispering, nudging each other. A couple walking past slowed their steps. A teenager on his bike nearly ran into a parking meter. But Shaq? Shaq wasn't here for them. His eyes locked onto the salon doors, and his expression remained stone cold. Inside, the salon workers had already started panicking. The receptionist was the first to notice. She had been anxiously peeking toward the window ever since Lucille made that phone call. But when she actually saw him, her breath hitched. Oh, my God, she whispered under her breath. The other stylists followed her gaze, and a ripple of tension spread through the room. Renee, the senior stylist, had just finished whispering to one of the younger girls about how to smooth things over when she caught sight of the man walking toward their door. Her throat went dry. No one said a word. Then, the glass doors swung open. Shaq stepped inside. The air shifted. For the first time in its existence, Madeline's Luxe Salon fell completely silent. Every stylist, every receptionist, every customer felt the weight of his presence. It wasn't just his size, though he was impossibly large in the delicate manicured space. It was his silence, a silence that demanded answers. Lucille stood near the waiting area, still poised, still calm. But there was something new in her eyes now, a quiet certainty that things were about to change. The receptionist was the first to react. She stumbled out from behind the desk, her fake smile returning in full force. Mr. O'Neill, she chirped, her voice a little too high. What a wonderful surprise. We're so honored to have you here. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He didn't even look at her. Instead, his deep voice rumbled through the room like distant thunder. What changed? The receptionist froze. I'm sorry? Shaq's gaze finally shifted to her. What changed? He repeated. His tone was steady, controlled, too controlled. The receptionist fumbled for words. I'm not sure I understand. You didn't have room for my mother 10 minutes ago, Shaq said, his voice cutting through the air. But now you do? The receptionist swallowed hard. I think there was a misunderstanding. Shaq tilted his head slightly. A misunderstanding? The way he said it made her wilt. Across the room, a younger stylist, one who had watched the entire situation unfold earlier, stood frozen near the shampoo station. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. Shaq's eyes flickered toward the main stylist chair, toward Renee. She had gone pale. For a woman who always carried herself with authority, who had dismissed Lucille so effortlessly just minutes ago, she now looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floor. Shaq took a step toward her. She instinctively stepped back. Lucille remained still, watching. Finally, Shaq spoke again. You, he said. Renee's breath hitched. Yes, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then he asked, Why? Renee blinked. I don't... Shaq tilted his head slightly. Why wasn't my mother good enough for this place? The entire salon held its breath. Renee's lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He just waited. And somehow that was worse than if he had yelled, because there was no excuse. No way to justify what had just happened. And they all knew it. One of the other stylists, a woman in her early 30s with auburn curls and a tense expression, broke first. I didn't agree with it, she blurted out, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't say anything, but I knew it was wrong. Renee's head snapped toward her. What are you doing? She hissed under her breath. But the woman, Nicole, had already stepped forward. Her gaze flickered to Shaq, then to Lucille. I should have spoken up, she admitted. I'm sorry. The receptionist flinched. The truth was starting to spill, and no one could stop it now. Shaq remained silent, watching. Another stylist shifted uncomfortably near the blow-dry station. A younger woman with a messy bun and nervous eyes. She hesitated. Then her voice came out small. They tell us not to take certain customers. Renee's face went red. That's not... It's true. Nicole cut in, her voice stronger now. They never say it directly, but we all know. Certain customers. She swallowed hard. The ones who don't fit the brand. Lucille's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. Shaq, however, remained stone cold. He let out a slow breath through his nose. Then, finally, he spoke. You know what's funny? He said, his voice calm, but lethal. My mother has been in rooms with people you wouldn't even dream of. No one dared to breathe. She raised 4 kids on her own, Shaq continued. She worked jobs you wouldn't last a day in. She gave up everything so we could have something better. And you? You looked at her for 2 seconds and decided she wasn't good enough for your chairs? Renee looked away. Shaq chuckled lowly. You messed up. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Then, Shaq turned to his mother. You ready, Ma? Lucille smiled, a quiet victory in her eyes. I think I've been ready, she said. And with that, they walked out. Inside the salon, no one spoke. The air felt hollow. Nicole, the stylist who had admitted the truth, stood frozen, her chest rising and falling as she processed what had just happened. The receptionist turned to Renee, her face pale. What do we do now? She whispered. Renee said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. They had made their choice. And now, they would have to live with it. The weight of Shaquille O'Neal's presence still lingered in the salon like a thundercloud. Silent, imposing, undeniable. The tension in the room was thick, the air barely moving as stylists and customers alike sat frozen, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But it never came. Because Shaq didn't yell. He didn't need to. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He spoke. Shaq turned to face the room, his massive frame dwarfing everything around him. He let his gaze sweep over the salon, pausing just long enough to make everyone feel the weight of what they had done. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, not raised in anger, but controlled, each word landing like a stone dropping into still water. I want to tell y'all something about my mother. A silence stretched. Lucille, standing beside him, didn't move, didn't need to. Shaq continued, his voice calm but carrying the kind of weight that demanded listening. My mom, he said, looking directly at Renee, is the strongest person I know. Renee, the senior stylist, visibly stiffened. Shaq's expression didn't change. You see, when people look at me, they see success. They see money. They see an NBA player, a businessman. But what they don't see is the woman who got me here. He let that sink in for a moment. Lucille lowered her gaze slightly, but there was something proud and unshaken in the way she stood beside her son. Shaq went on. My mother raised 4 kids on her own. She worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs to make sure we had food on the table. There were nights she didn't eat so we could. The room remained dead silent. She taught me what respect means, Shaq continued. Taught me to hold doors open, to say yes ma'am and no ma'am. Taught me to never think I was better than anyone. but to never let anyone think they were better than me either. His eyes flickered toward the receptionist. But that's exactly what happened today, isn't it? The receptionist's face turned red. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Shaq tilted his head slightly. Y'all thought she didn't belong here. You made that decision before she even sat down. A few of the stylists shifted uncomfortably. Some of the customers, once frozen in place, now looked down, suddenly ashamed to be part of this moment. But Shaq wasn't finished. He turned back to Renee, locking eyes with her. You work in a salon, right? He asked. Renee hesitated. Yes. So, you know something about roots? A beat of silence. Renee blinked, confused. Roots? Shaq nodded. Yeah. You spend all day working on hair, treating it, cutting it, coloring it. You know how important roots are, don't you? The room felt like it was holding its breath. Because no matter what you do to change the outside, Shaq continued, you can't change what's underneath. Renee's face tightened. Shaq leaned forward just slightly, not to intimidate, but to make sure she was listening. And the truth is, what's underneath all this? He gestured toward the salon, the stylists, the expensive chairs, the customers still pretending not to listen. It's rotten. A sharp inhale came from someone in the back. Renee flinched like she had been slapped. Shaq didn't blink. My mother didn't deserve to be treated like she was less than, he said. She deserves respect. He let his words settle, let them sink into every corner of the room. Then, after a long pause, he turned back to Lucille, and he asked the final question. Ma, you want to come back here? The question hung in the air. Renee's fingers curled tightly around the comb she was still holding, her jaw locking as she waited for the answer. Lucille didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a small, deliberate step forward. She looked around the salon, the velvet chairs, the pristine mirrors, the staff who were suddenly so desperate to be accommodating. She saw the fear in their faces, the regret, the realization that they had made a mistake they couldn't take back. Then, finally, she let a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. I think, she said smoothly, I'll find a place that deserves me. The words landed like a final blow, a verdict. Renee closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as if she had just lost something she didn't even know she had. The receptionist looked down. The younger stylist, Nicole, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And Shaq? Shaq just nodded. Let's go, Ma. Without another word, they turned and walked toward the door. As they stepped outside, Lucille let out a soft, satisfied sigh. She reached over, patted Shaq's arm. You always did know how to make a point, baby. Shaq chuckled. Learned from the best. The glass doors of Madeline's Luxe Salon swung shut behind them. And just like that, they were gone. Inside, no one spoke. Because what was there left to say? The sun had barely set over Orlando when the first ripples of the day's events began to surface online. What started as a murmur quickly escalated into a roar as the story of Lucille O'Neill's experience at Madeline's Luxe Salon spread across social media platforms, news outlets, and blogs. It began innocuously enough. A bystander, who had witnessed the incident unfold, took to Twitter. Just saw at Shaq stand up for his mom at a salon that tried to turn her away. Respect. Mom O'Neill, Tostow stand up. The tweet included a discreet photo of Shaquille O'Neal standing protectively beside his mother inside the salon. Within minutes, the post garnered thousands of retweets and likes, igniting conversations across the platform. Major news outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines flashed, Shaquille O'Neal confronts salon over mother's mistreatment. NBA legend defends mother against alleged discrimination. Madeline's Luxe Salon faces backlash. After incident with Shaq's mother. Journalists scrambled to gather details, reaching out to witnesses, salon employees, and the O'Neill family for comments. The salon's Yelp and Google reviews were inundated with negative feedback, dragging their ratings down within hours. The public's response was polarized. Many rallied behind the O'Neill family, praising Shaq for his swift action and expressing outrage over the salon's behavior. Unbelievable that in this day and age, Lucille O'Neall would face such disrespect. Kudos to Shaq for standing up, one Facebook user commented. However, a faction emerged, defending the salon, suggesting the incident was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Let's not jump to conclusions. We don't know the full story. Innocent until proven guilty, a tweet read. As the debate intensified, investigative netizens delved into Madeleine's Luxe Salon's history. Old reviews and testimonials surfaced, hinting at a pattern of discriminatory practices. Former employees anonymously shared their experiences on forums, describing an unspoken policy of catering to a specific clientele while subtly discouraging others. A Reddit post detailed, "I used to work there. We were told to politely suggest other salons to certain people. It was all about maintaining a brand image." These revelations added fuel to the fire, shifting the narrative from an isolated incident to a systemic issue within the establishment. Amid the uproar, all eyes turned to Shaquille O'Neal for a statement. Reporters camped outside his residence, and his social media accounts were flooded with messages seeking his perspective. Yet, Shaq remained conspicuously silent. This deliberate non-engagement spoke volumes. By choosing not to comment, he allowed the public to form their own judgments based on the unfolding facts. His restraint was interpreted by many as a testament to his character, suggesting that the truth of the incident was evident without his input. Facing mounting pressure, Madeleine's Luxe Salon released an official statement. "We deeply regret the incident involving Mrs. O'Neal. It was never our intention to cause distress, and we are reviewing our policies to ensure such misunderstandings do not occur in the future." The statement, however, was met with skepticism. Critics pointed out the lack of accountability and the vague language used, perceiving it as a superficial attempt at damage control. The incident sparked a wider conversation about discrimination in service industries. Talk shows featured segments on implicit bias, and opinion pieces in major newspapers dissected the societal implications of such events. One columnist wrote, "This isn't just about one salon's actions. It's a reflection of broader issues in our society regarding how we perceive and treat individuals based on appearance and preconceived notions." In the weeks that followed, the furor gradually subsided. Madeleine's Luxe Salon saw a significant decline in clientele, prompting them to implement comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training for their staff. While the O'Neal family refrained from further public comment, their handling of the situation left an indelible mark on public discourse. The incident served as a poignant reminder of the pervasive nature of discrimination and the importance of standing up against it, not through loud retaliation, but with dignified silence that compels society to reflect and act. The ride back was quiet. The black SUV moved smoothly through the streets of Orlando, the city lights casting a soft glow on the windows. Inside, Shaquille O'Neal sat beside his mother, his massive frame taking up more than half the back seat. His shoulders were still tense, his jaw tight, his mind replaying everything that had just happened. Lucille, however, sat with quiet ease. Her hands rested gently in her lap, her expression unreadable. She gazed out the window as the world passed by, looking as if the incident at the salon had never even happened. Shaq stole a glance at her. "How you feeling, Ma?" he asked. Lucille smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I'm feeling just fine, baby." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't get it," he muttered. "How do you just let that roll off you like that?" Lucille turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "You think that rolled off me?" Shaq hesitated. "Didn't it?" Lucille sighed, shifting slightly in her seat. "Shaquille, let me tell you something. When I was younger, people used to talk down to me all the time, told me what I could and couldn't do, where I did and didn't belong." She shook her head. "Back then, I didn't have much of a choice but to take it. I had 4 babies to feed, no time for pride." Shaq listened, his hands clasped together. "But you know what I learned?" she continued, looking at him now. "I learned that not every fight needs a war. Some battles, you win by standing tall and walking away." Shaq scoffed. "But why should we have to walk away, Ma? Why should people like that get to say and do whatever they want without consequences?" Lucille reached over, placing her hand gently over his. "They didn't get away with anything, baby," she said softly. You think those people in that salon are sleeping easy tonight? You think they're not in there, replaying every single word, regretting every choice they made? Shaq let out a slow breath. He knew she was right. Lucille squeezed his hand. Real strength isn't just about standing your ground, Shaquille. It's about knowing when to leave with your dignity intact. Silence filled the car for a moment, a comfortable silence. Then, Lucille smiled again, her voice lighter. Besides, you handled it just fine. Shaq chuckled. I didn't even do anything. Lucille gave him a playful look. Oh, you did plenty. Shaq shook his head, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're something else, Ma. Lucille leaned back against the seat, looking out the window again. I know, baby. I know. The morning air was crisp as Shaq sat in his home office, scrolling through news headlines on his laptop. The story had spread like wildfire. Every major outlet had covered it. Social media was still buzzing. People had a lot to say about what happened. Some defended the salon, calling it a misunderstanding. Others weren't buying it. The reviews on Madeline's Luxe Salon's page had plummeted overnight. Their official statement had been met with backlash. Shaq could have easily responded. He could have dragged them through the mud. But what would that change? His mother had already taught them the lesson. And now? Now it was up to the world to decide what to do with it. Instead, he chose to do something bigger. Later that afternoon, Shaq sat in front of a camera, his massive hands clasped together, his deep voice carrying its usual warmth and authority. I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday, he started, looking directly into the camera. And I want to say this. My mother is the strongest woman I know. She's been through more in her life than most people can imagine, and still, she carries herself with grace, dignity, and power. He paused, his expression serious. But not everyone has the platform that I do. Not everyone has the ability to walk into a room and demand accountability just by standing there. A beat. That's why I'm making a donation today to organizations that support racial equality and fairness in business. Because respect, that should be for everyone. The video was posted to his social media accounts, and within minutes, it began to spread. News outlets picked it up immediately. But more importantly, it started a conversation. People began sharing their own experiences, stories of being turned away, looked down on, treated as less than, all because of an assumption. The comment sections filled with testimonies, voices that had been silenced for too long. Shaq didn't say another word about the salon. He didn't have to. That evening, Lucille sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. A warm breeze drifted through the trees, rustling the leaves, carrying the sounds of distant laughter from children playing down the street. Her phone buzzed beside her. She picked it up, putting on her glasses as she read the latest headlines. Shaq's donation had sparked something bigger than she had expected. She smiled to herself, shaking her head. Her son. Always thinking bigger. She knew some people would never change. She knew there would always be those who judged others by what they saw on the surface. But she also knew this. Dignity speaks louder than anger. And today, the world listened. A week later, Lucille walked into a different salon. It wasn't as fancy as Madeline's Luxe. It didn't have gold-framed mirrors or velvet waiting chairs. But the energy? It was warm. Welcome. A stylist with kind eyes greeted her with a genuine smile. Welcome in, Ms. O'Neill. We've been expecting you. Lucille smiled back. Now that's more like it. As she settled into the chair, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror. She saw herself, strong, respected, unshaken. And this time, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. Moments like this happen every day, in places just like this, to people who don't have a platform to fight back. So what happens when no one's watching? It's time to challenge the spaces that claim to be exclusive, and ask, exclusive to who? And why? Next time you witness injustice, don't just stand there. Be the shift. Make them remember.